So let's move on to section 5.5. We've got to work our way through 3 slides in this video, but before we start on... So before we start on this particular slide, I just want to go back and review this one, because reviewing this will help us understand what is in this video. So where we got to in this slide, which was the last one on the previous video, was that this equation holds, but we're not still quite sure why it holds. It is an equilibrium condition, so it's not an identity. An identity is 1 + 1 = 2. That an identity equation always holds. This is more an equilibrium condition. So it holds in equilibrium, but it can sometimes not hold. But if it doesn't hold, it will quickly return back to equilibrium, so we have equality in that equation. Okay, so it's not an identity, it's an equilibrium condition. So think of it this way, if this equation holds, then the economy is in equilibrium in a particular sense. There's a lot of different types of equilibriums in macroeconomics and economics in general. This is just sort of another equilibrium type condition. So we know that equation holds, but we're not quite sure why it holds or how it holds yet. And we went back to this example. Let's go back to this example where you were spending 50,000 Australian dollars on a very luxurious holiday in New Zealand. It was either a very luxurious holiday or a very, very long holiday. But either way, you're spending 50,000 in NZ, and to actually spend your Australian dollars in NZ, what you had to do was enter the foreign exchange market, and someone with New Zealand dollars had to buy those 50,000 Australian dollars off you. And then the idea is that person would take your 50,000 Australian dollars and spend them on something in Australia. And we considered the example of Commonwealth Bank shares, or maybe $50,000 worth of wheat. So let's just consider the Commonwealth Bank shares example again. When you take 50,000 Australian dollars and you want to spend that money overseas, in effect, you can consider that as an outflow of money from Australia. You're taking your Australian dollars and you want to spend them overseas. So in a sense, that money is kind of leaving Australia, in a sense. But then what's happening is the buyer of your Australian dollars in the Forex market, they are taking the $50,000 they purchased off you in the Forex market and sending the money straight back into the country by buying Commonwealth Bank shares. So in a sense, your $50,000 goes from your bank account into the foreign exchange market and comes straight back into the bank account of the people that, or the person that sold these CBA shares. So in a sense, your money never left the country. And it kind of makes sense, because in net terms, your money never left the country, because your 50,000 Australian dollars, there's only one place they can be spent, that is Australia. So the money just doesn't leave. Now, there's that, you can look at it that way, or you can look at it in the following sense, and I like to look at it this particular way. You were generating an outflow of Australian money. Sorry, you were generating an outflow of Australian dollars to overseas. That was you buying your holiday. You were kind of, in a sense, sending $50,000 overseas. You're pushing the money offshore. But then this New Zealander, this investor, pushed an equivalent amount of money, $50,000, back into the country. So in a sense, inflows of money equals outflows of money. So to and from Australia, I mean. So the outflow of money was $50,000 to purchase your holiday, but an equivalent amount of money flowed back in through the purchase of Commonwealth Bank shares by the foreigner. Inflows equal outflows. What is the net flow of money? Zero. If you've got $50,000 flowing out with another $50,000 flowing in, the net flow is zero. If, however, you had $1 million flowing out of Australia and only $500,000 flowing back in, then you'd have a net outflow of $500,000. But in this situation, the net flow is $0. We've had an outflow, then a matching inflow. So the next thing to figure out, and this is what this slide is all about, is what makes that happen. But just keep in mind that that inflow equaling outflows down here ensured that NCO actually equals net exports. So the fact that we have a matching inflow and outflow of money in this example ensured that NCO equals NX. So the exchange rate being at equilibrium is actually what ensures that this holds. Now, I need to take a little bit of time to explain something about exchange rates. Then we'll come back to why the exchange rate ensures that that equation holds. And so this is an equilibrium condition. You'll only get this holding if the exchange rate is at equilibrium. Now, luckily, in most economies, we have a floating exchange rate, so the exchange rate moves very quickly to equilibrium. So in this diagram, we've got a floating exchange rate system. This is Australia, Canada, the UK, the US. Most countries around the world have a floating exchange rate system, which means the exchange rate is free to move quickly to equilibrium. So if the demand curve shifts to the right for the Australian dollar in the foreign exchange market, the exchange rate will appreciate and move quickly to the new equilibrium. So we've got the demand for Australian dollars generated by foreigners, and we've got the supply of Australian dollars generated by Australians. Remember, when I say things like that, I'm talking very, very loosely and very generally, just for the purpose of getting the concepts across. Now, of course, later in the course, we will be looking at fixed exchange rate systems and managed exchange rate systems, which complicate this idea that we're working through in this topic a little bit, but not much. We're just going to stick with floating exchange rates at the moment, which are the most common, and we will we'll look at fixed and managed exchange rate systems a little bit later in the course. Okay, so what we know is, what I'm telling you is that the exchange rate, by moving quickly to equilibrium, ensures that this equation holds, that net capital outflow or net foreign investment somehow equals net exports. Okay, next slide. Let's consider this equation again, but with reference to the foreign exchange market. So I've put some numbers on this model now, and I've got 1.2 billion being traded in the foreign exchange market, let's say over the course of a week. Let's say the course of a week. You can think about it as over the course of a year or a month. It really doesn't matter the time period that we are looking at. When I sort of say something like this, such as this is the amount traded over the course of a week, what I'm really doing is I'm saying that that is the average position of the demand curve, and that's the average position of the supply curve over that week, over that month. So some days you'd have the demand curve to the right of that position, some days to the left. But what I'm saying is that, yeah, that's fine, knowing that the demand curve moves left and right over the course of, hour to hour, day to day. If we're considering, say, a week or a month, then the demand curve kind of on average was there. The supply curve on average over that month, over that week or month was there. So over the full week or month, whatever we're talking about, $1.2 billion was traded in the foreign exchange market. This is a floating exchange rate system and we know that because the exchange rate's at equilibrium. If we had a fixed or managed exchange rate system, the diagram would actually be more complex, and I'd have to add some additional lines in. So we can worry about that later in the course. All we need to know now is that the exchange rate is flexible. It can move freely to the equilibrium point at the intersection of the demand curve for the Australian dollar and the supply curve. And so over the course of this week that we're thinking about, $1.2 billion were traded. Okay, so the first question is, at that equilibrium point, over the course of that week, who demanded or who purchased the $1.2 billion worth of Australian dollars? We kind of have an insight into that now. We know it's foreigners and they want to use that $1.2 billion worth of Australian currency to buy something Australian. That could be an Australian export, an Australian asset. It could be to make dividend payments to Australians who own foreign shares. It could be to make interest payments to Australians that own foreign bonds. Okay, assuming that those dividend payments and interest payments are going to be paid in Australian dollars to the Australians. Okay, normally interest payments and dividend payments are paid in the currency of the country making those payments. So I'm just simplifying it to make it a little bit easier. So I'm assuming that if you own shares in a tech company in Silicon Valley, that they will pay you dividends in Australian dollars. And that's why they'll be demanding Australian dollars to make that payment. So on this particular week, foreigners demanded $1.2 billion worth of Australian dollars to purchase Australian exports, to purchase Australian assets, maybe to make income payments in the form of dividend payments or interest payments on debt. The key thing to note, though, is that is effectively foreigners wanting to move $1.2 billion or the equivalent of 1.2 billion Australian dollars from overseas countries into Australia. That is an inflow of money, which is exactly what I've got up here. Foreigners demanding 1.2 represents an inflow of money into Australia. Think about it. We've got the foreign exchange market. Who will be demanding buying Australian dollars? It's got to be foreigners. 99% of the time, it'll be foreigners. You could have the odd Australian demanding Australian dollars if they've been gifted some British pounds or given some US dollars. Yeah, sure. But 99% of the time, it'll be foreigners demanding the Australian dollar. And why do they want Australian dollars? To buy something Australian. Now, we're not interested in them buying something Australian or making interest payments or dividend payments to Australians. We're interested in the money flows underlying those transactions. So when they buy Australian shares, bonds, real estate, Australian wheat or wool or coal or whatever they're buying, that represents money flowing into the country, into Australia. Okay, the supply curve. Who supplies Australian dollars? That's you, me, other Australians, people who have Australian dollars in their bank account. Australian businesses, the Australian government. At different points in time, we'll all supply the Australian dollar whenever we want to buy a foreign currency. So if you haven't figured it out already, at the point in time when you buy a unit of foreign currency, you are demanding that foreign currency, but you're simultaneously supplying the Australian dollar. You're simultaneously selling the Australian dollar. You have to sell an Australian dollar to buy a foreign currency. So the supply curve at equilibrium involves a whole group of Australian individuals and organisations supplying a total of 1.2 billion. Now, why would we together as Australians supply $1.2 billion worth of Australian dollars? Because what we want to do, we do it because what we want to do is take that 1.2 billion of Australian dollars, switch it into foreign currency so we can spend it overseas. So in a sense, we are sending $1.2 billion out of the country. And so the supply here in the second paragraph represents an outflow of money. Foreigners are sending it in, demand. Australians are sending it out, supply. At equilibrium, we will have, over the course of this week, $1.2 billion leaving Australia to purchase foreign goods and services, foreign assets, to pay dividend and interest payments to foreigners, etc., etc., etc. And we'll have exactly the same amount of money flowing back in through the supply curve. In that sense, on any given minute, on any given hour, any given day, week, or month, the inflows of money into Australia equal the outflows of money from Australia. And that's a convenient thing to have happen. Imagine if the exchange rate was allowed to somehow be down here, below the equilibrium level, just at my cursor. Just imagine if somehow it could be there and there was excess demand. Now that can never happen, but let's just imagine it could somehow magically happen. What are the implications of that? Well, if the exchange rate was well below ER1, we would have excess demand for the Australian dollar. Demand would be higher than supply. That means more money would be flowing in demand, more money would be flowing into the country than flowing out, and flowing out is supply. So we would have a net inflow of money. Now, of course, that can't happen, but that's what would happen if somehow the exchange rate could be below equilibrium. We'd have a net inflow of money into this country. Now, that actually can happen under fixed exchange rate systems. China's a good example. So even though I've said it can't happen, what I mean is it can't happen in Australia under a floating exchange rate system. And we're not really ready to explore how China operates its foreign exchange rate system and consider a situation where the exchange rate's well below equilibrium. So technically it can happen. It needs central bank intervention. It gets a little bit messy, but for now we'll ignore that. But just going back to the previous idea, if the exchange rate was somehow below equilibrium in Australia, we'd have more money flowing in than flowing out of the country, and the stock of money in the economy would just grow and grow and grow and grow. And then you would have an inflation issue, because we all know if you've got more money in the economy, there's more spending. If there's more spending, inflationary pressure is eventually going to be generated, and inflation will eventually be the outcome. So what we've got here, it's going to take a little bit of sort of thinking and maybe going back over the slides and re-listening to certain parts of this, as painful as that might be, before you get this. But what we get to is, at equilibrium, inflows and outflows of money are equal. Back here, when the outflow was 50,000 and it was matched by a corresponding inflow of $50,000, we use that logic to prove that NCO equals NX. So if the outflow of money, 50,000, equals the inflow of money, 50,000, that is true. Fast forward, and we've motivated all of this intuitively. Might just take you time to go back and think about it and re-listen. So then fast forward, we've got this equation here, and we know that holds if inflows equal outflows of money in and out of Australia. At that point, I've just motivated that 1.2 billion is flowing in because of the demand for the Australian dollar, but 1.2 billion is flowing out because of the supply of the Australian dollar. So at that point, inflows equal outflows. Therefore, NCO must equal NX at that point. What ensures that we're at that point? A flexible exchange rate that can quickly move to that point. That's pretty much it. So it is a floating exchange rate which can quickly move to this equilibrium point, which ensures that there is balance between our net foreign investment and our net exports. It all balances. Now, that may not be 100% clear yet, and I've got plenty of examples which will reinforce this. So there's more videos on the way which will reinforce this idea and really solidify this concept. And we'll be looking at some actual data, and that will, I think, help put all of the pieces into place. So then consider a hypothetical country for which that is true. Okay, so what does that mean? What does this mean? Intuitively, NCO equals 100 billion and NX equals 100 billion. What does that mean in terms of the inflows and outflows of money? Well, first of all, if both are 100 billion, then this important equation, NCO equals NX, obviously true. But intuitively, what do these values mean in terms of inflows and outflows of money? Okay, so here we go. NCO equaling 100 billion, that's a net capital outflow of 100 billion. That's outward net foreign investment of $100 billion from Australia to other countries in the world. I look at that and I think that is $100 billion flowing out of Australia in net terms. And then I look at this, NX, and I think that means exports are greater than imports to the tune of $100 billion. And that's an inflow of money. NCO being 100 billion, that's outward net foreign investment. That means we're sending $100 billion to the rest of the world in terms of our foreign investment flows. We're sending $100 billion more to foreigners than they are sending to us in the form of foreign investment. Another way of saying that is outward foreign investment from Australia to other countries is $100 billion higher than inward foreign investment. Either way, it's a net outflow of money. But then in a sense, the money comes back in to the country when we have a trade surplus of $100 billion. That is a positive level of NX, that's exports for which money comes into the country, being greater than imports for which money leaves. So outflow, net outflow is the top one associated with foreign investment, but the bottom one is a net inflow of money associated with trade. They balance, and they'll balance under a floating exchange rate system. Okay, so a little bit to wrap your head around it. Some of you may have dealt with the balance of payments and foreign investment flows and trade flows previously, but this is possibly a different take on these issues. The next thing we have to do is, if we understand that it is the foreign exchange market that ensures that this equation holds, we have to then come to some understanding of what shifts the demand curve for the Australian dollar and what shifts the supply curve of the Australian dollar. Because remember, what we're going to do with this equation is quite important. It's the exchange rate that moving to equilibrium that ensures this equation holds. So where this is taking us is this. If all of a sudden in Australia, we all start saving more money, then S goes up and S minus I becomes more positive, a larger number. So if we save more, S minus I increases, and we know that S minus I equals net capital outflow. So if we save more money in Australia, net capital outflow, the amount of excess savings we send overseas, that will increase as well. And if that happens, then temporarily, the left-hand side of this equation will be greater than the right-hand side. And then quickly adjustments will occur to make this balance again. Okay, so the way this will work is that if we increase savings and that variable increases, NX will then respond and increase. So what we're developing is quite an important thing here. We're developing an understanding of how an increase in savings can increase the value of X minus M or improve our trade performance. And so then soon we'll be able to start asking questions such as, if we know that savings affect trade, that is an increase in S in Australia leads to an increase in NX in Australia. If we kind of know that, then we'll be able to ask the questions very soon, such as why has Japan got such a large positive level of NX? Has it got to do something with a high level of savings in Japan? Or maybe not, but we'll be able to ask those questions. And so we're establishing important links between savings and investment, because NCO is S minus I, and exports and imports. So what is the relationship between savings minus investment and X minus M? That's where we're getting to. And S minus M is just a measure of net foreign investment, and NX is trade. So we're slowly we'll be establishing this important series of relationships, and we'll be developing an understanding of foreign investment flows and how that affects exchange rates and how that affects trade flows. And once you understand that, you'll be able to look at countries and then gain important insights into why those countries are in the situation that they are in. I've already sort of suggested Australia, well, the US, for example, has a very high level, the US has a very large negative value of NX. Well, why? And Japan has a very positive, high level of NX. Why? It's got to do with their investment flows. It's all linked, but most people don't understand this. And so, yes, this is all looking and sounding very theoretical, but wait until the end of this topic and the next topic when we start using this theoretical knowledge and looking at countries around the world. And that will really start opening your eyes to why Japan has a trade surplus. Why do they export so much more than they import? Same with Germany, same with Korea. And why are countries like the United States the opposite? Why do they import so much more than they export? It's a complex relationship, and we're slowly building up an understanding of that. So before we finish in terms of this video, we need an appreciation of what can shift the demand curve left and right, what can shift the supply curve left or right. And I've got it here. So I've got the demand curve for the Australian dollar shifting to the right and some examples of transactions that can lead to that. And I've got the supply curve of the Australian dollar shifting to the right as well, and some examples of transactions that can actually cause that. When the demand curve for the Australian dollar shifts to the right, the result is an appreciation of the Australian dollar. Down here, when the supply curve shifts to the right, the result is a depreciation of the Australian dollar. Okay, so what can cause the demand curve to shift to the right? An increase in the how are we going to word this? An increase in the exports of iron ore, or maybe just additional with exports of iron ore, we've got to consider it in terms of an increase in exports of iron ore. That'll shift the demand curve to the right. If the Italian government makes pension payments to Australian citizens who spent the first part of their life working in Italy, then the Italian government will need to purchase Australian dollars to pay those Australian citizens in Australian dollars. Now, you might be looking at that thinking, well, what if this Italian government makes the payment to these Australian citizens that used to live in Italy and work in Italy? What if the Italian government pays them in euros, the currency used in Italy? Well, it doesn't really make any difference, because if the Italian government pays those Australian citizens in euro, then it'll be the Australian citizens that create the demand for the Australian dollar when they take the euros they've received and exchange them for Australian dollars. Either way, someone's going to create a demand for the Australian dollar so that Australian dollars can get into the bank account of and be spent by the Australian citizen. Amazon pays dividends to Australian citizens. Should be an S on the end of that, doesn't matter. Japanese pension fund purchases Australian bonds. That should make sense now. Japanese pension fund wants to purchase Australian bonds. Those Australian bonds are denominated in Australian dollars. And so the Japanese pension fund, that's presumably has a stock of yen, they will need to switch those yen for Australian dollars to then buy the bonds. When they switch their yen into Australian dollars, they are creating a demand for the Australian dollar, which shifts the demand curve to the right. And then a private, US private equity firm buys an Australian company. They need to pay for that Australian company, presumably, because the owners, let's say the owners are Australian, they need to pay for that company Australian dollars, shift the demand curve to the right. All of these transactions involve increased money flowing from overseas into Australia. So we go from A to point B. That's the new equilibrium. Now just keep in mind, the movement to the new equilibrium is a little bit more complex than the movement simply from A to B. What will actually happen is at the old exchange rate down here, at A, the demand curve shifts to the right. So temporarily, demand for the Australian dollar is out here at point C, but supply is there at point A. So we've got excess demand. But very quickly, the exchange rate is going to appreciate. And as the exchange rate goes up, we move along the supply increases, or the quantity supplied increases, and we move from point A to point B. That's called an increase in quantity supplied. As the exchange rate increases, demand moves along the demand curve from C to B. That's called a decrease in quantity demanded. And so we get this jump in demand, but then the exchange rate goes up, so we get an increase in supply and a decrease in quantity demanded. That is movements along the supply curve and movements along the demand curve, which then together restore equilibrium at point B. Now that'll become important later, that we've separated out the movement from A to B into these different steps. So that's what can shift the demand curve. The supply curve can be shifted when Australians buy more foreign goods, services or assets, or make transfer payments of some sort overseas, or make dividend payments or interest payments on bonds to foreign citizens. So some examples. If you import clothing, you will be buying a foreign currency to pay for that clothing. And when you buy a foreign currency, you'll be supplying the Australian dollar. So the supply curve shifts to the right. If the Australian government makes aid payments to Indonesia, they'll be supplying the Australian dollar when they demand Indonesian currency to make those payments. BHP may make a coupon payment on or to the foreign owner of some of BHP's bonds. BHP will then supply the Australian dollar to exchange it for foreign currency to then make that payment to the the foreigner. And even if BHP pays the coupon payment to the foreigner in Australian dollars, then it's the foreigner who has those Australian dollars, and they'll shift the supply curve to the right when they transfer the Australian dollars into a foreign currency. And then finally, if you purchase Google shares, so that is outward, a form of outward foreign investment. If you purchase Google shares, then you'll need to supply the Australian dollar when you purchase US dollars to pay for the Google shares. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Obviously, these ideas that we're working on, that is this equilibrium equation and the fact that the exchange rate ensures that this equation holds, we're obviously going to continue developing our understanding of that. We've got quite a bit of complex material to go in this topic, so I think we're about halfway there. But the more complex material probably lies in the next couple of videos. So we've sort of been building ourselves up, I guess, to understanding this. But you know, just stick with it, because once we understand the model that we will be developing, and ultimately we will be developing a model that looks like that. Vertical line, downward sloping line. Once we develop this model, it's extraordinary what we can do with it and the insights that we can gain by applying that model to the situations of different countries around the world. It'll really open your eyes up. So at the moment, we know this identity holds, we know the exchange rate makes it hold, and we're just going to keep moving forward over the next couple of videos in this topic, furthering our understanding of this equation, what it all means, and then developing a model that represents that equation. And once we develop that model, we'll start to be able to learn about the relationship between foreign investment flows in and out of a country and that country's trade performance, its exports and imports. And then things will get interesting.